Welcome to Now in the 90s, where we look at the game releases of 30 years ago today. This week we got a tank simulator, the latest in a long-running adventure series, and yet another beat 'em up. Hi, I'm your host Jared, and today is June 24th, 1992. If there's one thing that's true about the world, it's that anything and everything can be capitalized on. Look no further than this week's first game, Garry Kitchen's Super Battletank War in the Gulf, released this week in 1992 for the Sega Genesis and the Super Nintendo. Super Battletank War in the Gulf is about everything it sounds like in the title. You play as an M1 Abrams tank during the Gulf War and Operation Desert Storm. As a tank, you slowly roll around and shoot other tanks. It's first person with the tank view, where about 2/3 of the screen is covered up by the tank, and you only have a few small windows to see any action, with the tank's turret slowly pivoting up above. It's a lot of wasted space, but the HUD is kind of cool as it displays all of your information in a more immersive way. You can see a mini-map, how much armor you have left, and the ammunition for your cannon, smoke screens, and the tank's laser. From there, you can swap to an overhead map, moving a tiny tank spec around to find targets to blow up. For the time, these graphics were considered very impressive, as the tanks and the people in the briefing screen were digitalized, making them look super realistic. The opening even had a pseudo FMV effect by having several stills of a real tank playing quick sequence. The game's box also boasted that it had blistering sound effects, which not so much. Honestly, it sounds like they used the exact same shot sound effect as the pistol for Doom. As stated in the title, Garry Kitchen's Super Battletank was designed and developed by Garry Kitchen. Garry made a name for himself in the 80s by making some absolute successes, namely porting the arcade hit Donkey Kong to the Atari 2600, an accurate port that sold over 4 million copies. He came from an era where third-party publishers, namely Activision, wanted to treat their developers the same way a record label would treat their musicians, with royalties and their name on the game's box. Think Sid Meier's Civilization, David Crane's A Boy and His Blob, or John Romero's Daikatana. It was because of Garry's successes that he went on to form his own studio, Absolute Entertainment. While the first thing they did was a port of the arcade game Crossbow to the Commodore 64, the first original game that they put out was A Boy and His Blob, which Garry helped co-design. After Super Battletank, Garry Kitchen's name was not added to any other game they made. Upon release, Super Battletank received positive reviews. GamePro issue 42 liked its challenge and realistic depth. As for today, Super Battletank reminds me of a slower on-the-ground version of Top Gun from the NES. There would be a Super Battletank 2 just for the Super NES a couple of years later, and it would also get ported to the Game Boy Advance as Operation Armored Liberty in 2003. Super Battletank was also ported to the Game Gear in 1994, and for whatever reason, re-released by Majesco for the Game Gear in 2001. Speaking of weird ports, here's another one. Released this week in 1992 was King's Quest V for the NES. King's Quest is a series that needs little introduction. Created by Sierra Online, it's known for pioneering the point-and-click adventure genre to new heights by using something called graphics. No more were you just typing in your parsed actions like in Zork. Now you can freely move King Graham around to save his kingdom of Daventry. King's Quest now has 9 total entries in the long-running franchise, but we're going to be focusing on just the 5th one. King's Quest V was originally released for home computers in 1990 and was known for having a significant improvement in visuals thanks to VGA graphics, and is the first King's Quest title to have a true point-and-click interface, no text commands here. Also in 1992, it would get a special CD-ROM based re-release that gave it some new features. Most notably, the voice acting that has become so loved and so reviled to this day.
Sam, watch out! A poison snake!
Now, the reason I bring all of that up is because we're talking about the NES version which has none of that. On one hand, it's incredibly impressive that such a massive game was able to be shrunk down onto an NES cartridge. On the other hand, look at it! It wasn't a good idea to begin with, but Konami did it. Obviously, the beautiful hand-painted graphics of the PC version get reduced down to a muddied mess and the animation's limited. The roughest part is that the easy point-and-click interface of the original is now using the NES D-pad to slowly move an arrow around to select anything, making the NES version clunky to play. The port to the NES version also meant there had to be some censorship. Any dialogue or words mentioning or alluding to death or killing had to be removed.
Where is Cedric?
Over there. Mordak may have killed him.
Some instances of nudity or even religious themes also had to be changed. Perhaps the worst change for the console version was that it only had 2 save slots. Anyone who's ever played any King's Quest game can tell you need at least 10 times that amount, because one wrong move and the game becomes unbeatable. You never know when you're going to need to restore. There was also a password system that was 15 characters long and just as annoying to enter as it was to play the game. Nintendo Power also knew that the NES version just wasn't very enjoyable to play because they wouldn't cover it until Nintendo Power issue 51, which came out in August of 1993, a full year after the game's release. They also kept calling it an RPG and said that it translated well to console, so they were all kinds of wrong. King's Quest V was not the first game to be put onto a home console. That would actually go to the first King's Quest game, which was put onto the Sega Master System. King's Quest V was slated to be released for the Sega CD based on the CD-ROM version that had all the voice acting, but that never came to be. King's Quest would not see itself on a home console again until the 2015 episode-based reimagining simply titled King's Quest. Also released this week in June is another forgotten game, Mystical Fighter for the Sega Genesis. As we've mentioned before, the early 90s were filled with beat-em-ups. We've had fantasy, we've had futuristic, and thanks to Mystical Fighter, there was feudal Japan. Rather than playing as ninjas again, you play as a kabuki warrior, with the whole game based around Japanese mythology. Characters, enemies, stages, bosses, you name it. Gameplay-wise, it's closer to Golden Axe than anything else. You punch some dudes, but can also pick up magic scrolls for screen-clearing attacks, and the more magic scrolls you have, the cooler it is. You're also able to do a Sonic-style spin dash and a couple of different throws, which apparently was important enough to show off on the game's box art. Mystical Fighter is another one of those games that has a normal mode and a hard mode, but you don't get to see the real ending unless you beat it on hard. Aside from its setting, Mystical Fighter is a pretty generic beat-em-up, with 2 players across 6 stages. GamePro issue 35 had a multi-page spread about all of the different beat-em-up games coming out, which included Mystical Fighter. Their review of it basically said that the graphics are nice, the sound effects do their job, but it's repetitive enough to bring it down. They listed it as a respectable 3rd place after Streets of Rage and 2 Crude Dudes, for whatever that's worth. Their review of it gave it an overall rating of a this face.
Editor Dylan here. Including the 3 we highlighted, there were 8 games released this week. Besides Mystical Fighter and Super Battletank, the Genesis also had Steel Empire, a steampunky side-scrolling shoot-'em-up where you can be a striker plane or a zeppelin. The Neo Geo had King of the Monsters 2, another beat-em-up, but is a sequel to a one-on-one kaiju wrestling game. And now they're teaming up against an alien invasion. It's actually pretty good. I played the heck out of the Super Nintendo version. The TurboGrafx 16 had Gunboat. You remember Super Battletank? It's that, but, you know, on water. And the Atari Lynx had Hydra. Remember Spy Hunter? It's that, but, again, water. Bit of a theme going on there, but those were the games that released this week in 1992. Back to you, Jared.
Over in the collector's corner, Super Battletank's value has completely evaporated. Neither the SNES or Genesis versions go for over $20, even with brand new sealed copies. The NES version of King's Quest V is surprisingly the most valuable version. It's loose for just under $40 and over $110 for it complete. If I had to guess, the increased price is due to console games being a far bigger target for collectors, computers and PC games. Despite not being remembered whatsoever, the biggest value gainer is Mystical Fighter. It released with an MSRP of $49.95, and now it loose goes for around $65, while complete is nearly $185. And that's it for today. Next week, we have an awkwardly named platformer, an ultra-violent game before Mortal Kombat, and one of the first runner types of games ever made. I'm your host, Jared, and this was Now in the 90s. Thanks for watching Now in the 90s. Please hit subscribe if you aren't already, and if you already are, thank you. Don't forget to like the video and leave a comment down below, especially about any of the games today. I love the King's Quest series. I actually just replayed King's Quest 6 just a couple of months ago over on my gameplay channel. I still love it, and I am super glad I never played the NES one.